Let's get straight into it today. We're reviewing the R7 2700X and showing numbers for the R7 2700, both of which are refreshes on the existing AMD R7 1700 product line. We acquired our CPUs from third-party sources rather than from AMD, but we've held and iterated on our data over the past month, which gives us some interesting information just from going through the whole process for that long. Today is the day to walk through a small portion of what we've found. We're releasing several videos surrounding Ryzen 2000 split apart for organization and time. This one is your review video recapping all the core performance metrics. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. So again, we've had these CPUs for about a month because we got them outside of embargo normal restrictions and things like that, but we respected embargo anyway. We have a ton of information as a result, including X470 versus X370, R5 2600X and 2600 performance, 2700 performance. We have more VRM thermal testing on the new X470 motherboards. We have PCB analysis from BuildZoid. We're splitting all of these into multiple videos because otherwise they would be very long. And also subscribe immediately because at least one other video will go up today and you're going to want to see that, and check back later today to catch that. So getting straight into it then, we are only overclocking one CPU in each family. So the R5 2600, R5 1600, whatever, we're only overclocking one of them, only overclocking one CPU for the R7 2700 or 1700 family because, or 17X, 18X, whatever, because it's the same thing. The R7s are all the same, and the R5s are mostly all the same, and they are the same for the new series. So for that reason, we're overclocking one, because 4.2 gigahertz on one equals 4.2 gigahertz on the other one. That stated, we're going to start with talking about some overclocking numbers rather than all the gaming stuff, because this is where it gets really interesting for Ryzen 2000 series. The main differences for the new CPUs actually come from the minimum voltage required to maintain a target frequency. So at 4 gigahertz on Ryzen 2000 versus 4 gigahertz on Ryzen 1000, we are able to operate at a significantly lower voltage. And that is where the primary advantages are derived, not from raw performance, because in terms of raw performance, you're talking hundreds of megahertz at most. This isn't a huge jump in terms of frequency or IPC or anything like that. We're sort of, at some level, looking at Intel-sized steps in raw gaming performance. You're talking single-digit percentages in some cases, low double digits in others. So we're not looking at big jumps. It's kind of like 6700 to 7700K CPUs. However, we see big jumps in things that aren't performance numbers. So what you need to pay attention to is not just the raw gaming performance, because if that's all you pay attention to when you watch other reviews, it's going to be really boring. But if you pay attention to things like the efficiency, the voltage required to sustain a fixed clock, that is where it gets interesting. So let's start there. We found that at a given frequency of 4 gigahertz, our R7 2700X held stable at 1.175 volts input at LLC level 4 on the Asus Crosshair 7 Hero, also acquired separately, which equated to 1.162 volts V-Core at SVTFN. The result was stability in Blender and Prime 95 with torturous FFTs, while measuring at about 129 watts power consumption in Blender, measured at our current clamp. For this same test, our 1700 at 4 gigahertz required a 1.425 volt input at LLC level 5, yielding a 1.425 V core, a 201 watt power draw, so 70 watts higher, and pushed thermals to 79 degrees T-die. Prime 95 produced similar results. You can find those in the article below, but the takeaway is that lower voltage for a given frequency also means lower power consumption for the same frequency. Again, 70 watts difference in that one test. To some extent, this is binning, but most of the large delta seen here is from improvement of the product's clock efficiency at the, quote, old high clocks of 4 gigahertz. This is somewhat exponential. So for 4 gigahertz, not a big deal. Basically 1.2 volts and below on the CPUs that we have. And for 4.2 gigahertz, that's where it changes quite a lot. To get 4.2 stable on our 2700X, our 2700, our 1600X, 2600X rather, all of them, 4.2 stable required 1.42 volts and above in some cases with high LLCs, and maxed LLCs in some cases, and we were not able to get 4.3 stable on basically anything. We tried, we worked on it, but closest we got was basically 4.25 sort of. Asterisk, it crashes sometimes. So that's kind of the takeaway here. Basically, the overclocking headroom, not exciting. The volt frequency curve, very interesting, and job well done AMD for improving that in very significant ways. So that's the takeaway I wanted to highlight. Now, again, one last thing here is that in order to step up the frequency a couple hundred megahertz, it requires a ton more voltage. That's what I'm saying. Next thing to talk about is memory overclocking. Also very interesting and in height of discussion with the Ryzen 2 rumors. There were some rumors, WCCF Tech, that earlier said something like 4100 megahertz would be achievable memory overclocking on Ryzen 2000 series. And to their credit, several months ago, we heard from vendors at some trade show that they were expecting 4000 megahertz to be doable. Not really. This is what it turns out to be. So memory overclocking hasn't changed much with Ryzen Plus and X470 platforms. Initial reports again suggested pretty high. We found that both of our platforms were capable of handling 3600 megahertz XMP for our G-Skill Trident Z kit, which is the one that we took to 4000 megahertz with our hashtag RipLTT build, so it can handle more than 3600. And it's not a big deal to boot at 3600 cold, but it's a bit better than early Ryzen launch memory training and things like that. So it required training to get from 3600 to 3666. We could not boot 3666 cold. We had to start at 3600, and then we could not take the memory higher than 3666. This is Samsung B-Die. It's a really good Trident Z kit that we are positive does 4000 megahertz plus. So we know it's a good kit. This comes down to the board to some extent, to the CPU IMC binning to some extent, and just to Ryzen. So as for memory scalability, we did some testing on that as well, and this gets very granular in that you need to be very careful about controlling timings, because otherwise frequency looks like there's zero scaling whatsoever. This test was conducted with completely controlled memory timings, meaning we controlled every single timing presented in UEFI. That includes sub-timings and tertiary timings, not just the first 4 or 5. When you control timings 100% and change only the memory frequency plus whatever unpresented timings are being modified, the result for TimeSpy is what you see on the screen now. TimeSpy is highly memory sensitive, and so it's a bit of an extreme case. We end up with 3666 megahertz plotting 9465 points, an uplift of 0.6% over 3600 megahertz, which is 0.4% over 3466 megahertz. You get the idea. There's absolutely scaling here, but it's incremental. At 3600 versus 3200 megahertz, we observed a 3.5% difference. Given the price difference in some regions, you may as well stick with 3200 megahertz. The difference between 32 and 2400 megahertz is tremendous though, marked at 12.5%. That's with TimeSpy, where memory is sensitive. Here's where it gets interesting. With the Crosshair 7 Hero, turning the frequency down a bit will result in an automatic tightening of subtimings, which results in increased performance overall. If you were to manually enforce 16, 18, 18, 36 timings and allow all other timings to be auto, which most users do, you'd have the results we've had on the screen for a moment here. And that's if you set the frequency manually, leave everything else the same, you end up with this chart. The result is much tighter than we saw previously. We suddenly have a range of a couple hundred points rather than 1400 points. Instead of 8070 to 9500, we're at 9100 to 9300. That's because the timings automatically tighten to a point of improving beyond the frequency improvement alone. This is mostly Asus is doing, and job well done Asus for doing that. Basically, if you're serious about getting everything out of performance that you can, you've got a lot of work to do on tuning the timings. Some motherboards, like the Asus Crosshair 7 Hero, will do a lot of that for you, and that's where the difference in motherboards comes from. That's why not all motherboards are the same. It's stuff like that. So job well done again on that. But this illustrates how testing can also be completely invalidated if you don't pay close attention. For example, if you're not changing those buried lower level timings and only the top ones, you'd see a couple hundred points difference. Looks like there's zero scaling difference at all. And that's what we started with before looking at those timings, which are being automatically tuned. So what this does teach us, though, is that if you go with a slower kit and frequency, but you can get tighter timings as a result of being a slower frequency, it kind of evens out. You really might as well go with 3200 megahertz with a tighter set of timings than something like 3600 with looser timings. And there are applications where maybe that's not the case. You hopefully know what they are if that's true. But for most people, We'd recommend 32. With good timings, you'll be fine. You're not missing much performance, if anything at all. And one more thing, TimeSpy is, of course, very sensitive to this. So here's an example of Firestrike, which doesn't use the same API as TimeSpy. We observed nearly zero scaling between memory frequencies, even when we controlled for timings. Cinebench also demonstrated nearly zero scaling difference, at least not until 2400 megahertz. Let's move into game streaming benchmarks next. We're presently showing PUBG gameplay at 10 megabits per second and faster on each side of the screen. One is a 2700X, the other is an 8700K, neither is overclocked. We'll reveal which these are in a moment, but we want to hide them from you for now so that you can view them without bias, and then maybe if you're wrong, you'll see what bias you have later. These benchmarks will be described in greater detail in the test methodology section that's linked in the article in the description below. As a quick recap, we're testing live streaming over a gigabit fiber connection using OBS, logging for network dropouts, which there were none, and X264 encoding. Our baseline test for a good quality stream is considered 10 megabits per second upload with X264 faster enabled. That's what we use for our live streams or close to it. If all CPUs pass that, we stress them with the X264 medium and 12 megabit per second uploads. Our goal is to upload 100% of frames to stream and drop 0, ideally all near 16.7 millisecond delivery times. We also want to lose as little FPS from baseline non-streaming gameplay as possible. In other words, we care about the scaling of how each CPU handles streaming for both the player, the streamer in this case, and the viewer. Our goal is efficiency in delivering a 60 FPS stream, 0 drops, which would be considered a perfect stream, while also maintaining a high player side FPS so that the streamer can have a good experience too. We're starting with PUBG and streamer side FPS. So this is what the streamer, the player, would see, not what the viewer would see. Both are important parts of the equation. For the streamer, we're observing a baseline FPS of 132 FPS average for the R7 2700X when stock, which decays to 101 FPS average when streaming at 10 megabits per second faster H.264. The 1% lows are relatively proportionate to 57 FPS average at the bottom end. At 12 megabits per second and stressed with a rather unrealistic medium encode speed, but used as a synthetic test, we fall to a still fully playable 83 FPS average and 47 FPS 1% lows. The streamer is perfectly happy in this instance. The 8700K's baseline, no stream at all, that's what baseline means, it's baseline, is hitting a frame rate cap and averages at 141 FPS average. It'd be higher without that ceiling. We're at comparable low values to the 2700X. Streaming at 10 megabits per second faster brings us to 124 FPS average or 107 FPS for medium. As for which was which, we can pop those labels up now on the 8700K and 2700X from the earlier footage. Technically, the 8700K is in the lead for streamer side performance, but that's only, again, half the equation. For viewer side, things change a lot and quickly. First off, both the 8700K and 2700X stock CPUs deliver 100% of frames to the stream at our 10 megabit per second faster preset, with 98% and 99.9% of frames delivered within our 16.7 millisecond target. This is excellent performance for each CPU, and either is fully capable of gameplay while streaming. There's functionally no downside to either for this preset while streaming for the viewer. For the player, there's a bit of a difference, yes. Notice, however, that the 8700K crumbles when pressed with H.264 medium and 12 megabit per second encoding. We end up at 32.4% of all frames delivered, meaning that the stream drops 70% of frames, or thereabouts. We'll show those videos side by side now. We overclocked the 8700K to see if performance could meet the stock 2700X and found that it still underdelivered at 84.2% of all frames. This disparity is partially a result of the 2 fewer cores and partially a result of scheduling. More resources were spent on the game than OBS with Intel. This can be rectified with manual affinity and priority tuning for OBS. You can correct for that loss somewhat, but it's extra work for the streamer. It is not out-of-box, easy performance to configure. Here's Dota 2 and the player-side performance for Dota 2. In terms of raw FPS, the 8700K easily chart-topped, as Intel often does in this game. This game is heavily dependent on 1 to 2 threads, and that's why we see the frequency advantage. They are capped at 1 to 2 threads, pegged nearly 100%. We're at 181 FPS average versus 149 FPS average, with lows reasonably comparable and within Dota's variance. At 10 megabits per second, those numbers are 138 and 108 FPS average. 12 megabit per second and medium puts a huge strain on each CPU versus baseline, producing large losses from baseline as resources are reallocated to the stream. Here are the streaming results. At the good quality setting, we're at 100% of frames encoded on both the 8700K and 2700X, with frame time consistency both good. At 12 megabits per second, we lose 60% of our frame delivery on the stock 8700K and about 7% of our delivery on the 2700X. Here's a comparison of the 12 megabit per second playback video on both Intel and Ryzen put next to each other. This is, again, a thread and scheduling advantage. Ryzen has more threads to throw at encoding in medium configuration, which matters far more than frequency for this task. Where AMD is behind in FPS streamer side, it is far ahead in viewable stream quality. Intel is killing AMD in raw frame rate streamer side, definitely, but they're getting killed in viewer side playback. In this workload, which is again somewhat synthetic because it's so abusive, the viewer side playback matters most. Overclocking Intel helped tremendously, but not enough to come close to the 2700X. Again, tuning with priority and affinity would largely help with this, but that's asking for a lot of extra work and it doesn't perfectly fix the problem. At the end of the day, more threads is more better, provided a reasonably similar frequency for this type of workload. You could also cap game frame rate to further relieve Intel's resources to, say, 60 FPS, but the point is that the 2700X is natively more advantaged than Intel here. We didn't need to overclock the 2700X to sustain reasonable quality, so we didn't. Closing out the streaming section, here are two 10 megabit per second faster clips next to each other from the 8700K and the 2700X. They're basically the same. So the takeaway here is that yes, both the 8700K and the 2700X are perfectly capable of delivering a high quality viewer experience. And the 8700K does have an advantage in player side experience. That said, if you try to increase the quality of your stream beyond what you're seeing right now, then AMD holds an advantage for the viewer, which is easily arguable as the most important aspect of streaming. Basically, with the 2700X, you have a bit more headroom to increase your stream quality over the 8700K, even though both can do it just fine if you have the same slightly lower quality. For some production benchmarking, we're using Blender 2.78 and 2.79 for in-house render benchmarks. The newer Blender 2.79 GN Monkey Head render passes the R7 2700X towards the top of our charts, requiring 23 minutes to render when stock, using X370, and basically the same amount of time when using X470 in stock settings. Running 4.2 GHz all-core doesn't get us much, considering how XFR2 works, and pushes us to 22 minutes. Again, consider that this is functionally pre-overclocked anyway, hence the limited difference between manual overclocks. For comparison, the Threadripper 1920X stock CPU completed its render in 17 minutes, about a 25% time reduction. The i7 8700K at 4.9 GHz finishes its render in 24 minutes, marking a stock 2700X as 4% reduced in time requirement, a good thing. Going to 5.0 GHz almost ties the two, with an overclock on the 2700X, pulling it about a minute ahead of the overclocked 8700K at 5 GHz. When overclocked, the 8700K is functionally equal in performance. Stock, however, the 8700K ends up at 26.5 minutes, allowing the 2700X stock to reduce its time requirement by 12.5%. The 2700X stock CPU is also approximately 13.5% reduced in time requirement from the stock original 1700X that we retested on the X470 motherboard. Our GN logo render test is the most abusive and stressed the 2700X overclock to a point that we could not achieve stability at 4.2 GHz. And it wasn't worth going to 4.1 since that would result in equivalent or worse performance than stock with XFR2. For this one, the 1920X leads the 2700X stock CPU on X470 by about 28% time reduction, a substantial change for anyone serious about CPU rendering. The 8700K overclocked at 5 GHz lands at 28.6 minutes, allowing the 2700X a 2% time reduction over the high-end Intel CPU. Of course, note that we don't have any Intel HEDT parts on here presently, as those have been busy with RIP LTT streams and other ongoing content. For time spy and other synthetics, check the link in the description below for the full article. Moving on to game benchmarks, Assassin's Creed Origins is new to our test bench. For this one, the AMD R7 2700X stock CPU performs at 107 FPS average with X470, or 112 FPS average when overclocked to 4.2 GHz. Lows are reasonably tightly timed, in the 80s for 1% and 70s for 0.1%. We want consistency of frame times, and we got that here. The stock R7 2700 performs at about 103 FPS average, marking the stock 2700X as 4.2% ahead at 107 FPS average. The R7 2700X performs about 7.5% ahead of the R7 1700X stock CPU, on X370, and overclocking the R7 1700 to 4 GHz gets it to 106 FPS average, with lows reasonably behind. This places it below the stock 2700X, with the overclocked 2700X about 5.7% ahead. The 8700K stock CPU operates at 120 FPS average, with lows at 91 and 80, thus landing the 8700K about 11.6% ahead of the stock 2700X. The i5 8600K is also a bit ahead, including rough equivalency in frame time pacing and consistency of the lows. Overclocking the 8700K pushes out GPU limits and hits a bottleneck, landing us at 125 FPS average, or 12% ahead of the 2700X overclocked. For comparison, here's Assassin's Creed at 1440p. Most of the differences vanish, thanks to the creation of a hard GPU bottleneck that prohibits further scaling on the CPU. Still, the Intel CPUs hold a bit of a lead, averaging about 10 FPS, or around 10% of a lead. Watch Dogs 2 at 1080p is next. For this one, the 2700X stock CPU and overclocked 2700X perform equivalently with thanks to XFR2's frequency boosting. 2700X stock CPU ends up 6.5% ahead of the stock 2700 non-X, but keep in mind that overclocking the 2700 nets the same performance. They're the same thing, basically. 2700X at 111.8 FPS also ends up about 10.4% ahead of the stock 1700X, although overclocking the original R7 CPUs closes that gap partially, as indicated by the R7 1700 at 4 GHz. The 8700K stock CPU at 132.5 FPS maintains a lead of 18.5% over the stock 2700X at 111 FPS, 0.8. The lows are also advantaged somewhat significantly on the 8700K, marking its overall frame time consistency as superior in this test. Overclocking gives us extra performance, but not much. At 1440p, we observe similar performance to what we saw in Assassin's Creed Origins. Our numbers plot AMD CPUs as limited to about 92 to 98 FPS average, where Intel CPUs are limited to about 102 to 106 FPS average. Project Cards at 1080p posts the 2700X stock CPU at 111 FPS average, with overclocking boosting to 114 FPS average. This lands the 2700X stock CPU about 10% ahead of the 2700 non-X, which overclocked to equivalence, and about 14.4% ahead of the R7 1700X with X470. The fact that the 8600K at 5 GHz passes the stock 8700K but comes close to the 5 GHz 8700K suggests that Project Cars favors frequency to threads. That'd be where a rather sizable difference in data emerges, with the stock 8700K's 135.8 FPS average landing 22% ahead of the 2700X stock CPU. Overclocked, we end up at 152 FPS average, 122 FPS 1% lows, and so forth, which is 34% ahead of the overclocked 2700X. Clearly, there's still something to be said for frequency in some applications. We have a couple of other games we tested as well. We'll leave them in the link below, otherwise the video will be too long. Let's move on to power testing next. This is where we need to put a note here. AMD's version of TDP isn't comparable to Intel's. They measure them differently, and so the numbers are not something you can't say 95 watt TDP 8700K is less than 105 watt TDP on 2700X. It doesn't work that way. So not for just the power drawn anyway. That's not a power drawn number. It's basically how much cooling is needed to keep the CPU under a certain spec. So numbers are reached in different ways. For AMD, TDP is calculated by subtracting 42 from 61.8 and then dividing it by 0.189. Those numbers, if you're wondering, are derived from what AMD claims to be the optimal T-case temperature, 61.8 degrees Celsius, what they claim to be optimal inlet temperature for the heatsink fan, 42 degrees Celsius, and then 0.189 basically degrees per watt of the heatsink. So for power testing, Cinebench multi-threaded positions the 2700X stock CPU at 143 watts consumption when left to full auto settings, or 192 watts when overclocked to 4.2 gigahertz and 1.4 volts. The 1700X stock operated at 113 watts multi-threaded. Single-threaded, the 2700X operated at 46 watts on the X470 board. So we're on the single thread chart now, or 37 watts on the X370 board. The 1700X ran at 43 watts, X470, 37 watts, X370, you get the idea. For 3D Mark Physics, we measured 80 watts for the stock 1700X, 110 watts for the overclocked 1700X, and 100 to 106 for the stock 2700X. Overclocking pushed us to 130 watts on the 2700X. And that's why I wanted to point out the TDP difference, because in Cinebench, again, stock, no changes, just XFR2, we're approaching 150 watts, which is quite far from 105 watts. That's because it's not measuring the same thing. So when you're buying a heatsink, just make sure you're careful of what you buy and that it can actually sustain up to 140, 150 watts for a stock 2700X, basically. That's what you're looking for. So yeah, conclusion, we're working on some major volt frequency content with thermals. You'll want to check back for that. That's going to be really cool. And we have a 2600X review coming up momentarily. As for what you should buy, it's like before, except more stable, fewer blue screens, almost zero now. So round of applause, AMD. That's actually a really serious improvement to have nearly zero blue screens this time. Quite happy with it. When we do get blue screens, it comes from timings on the memory. Most of those have been fixed with UEFI updates in the final hour here, so it's pretty stable at this point. It's nearly perfectly stable now. Overclocking doesn't get you much. Don't bother in most cases. XFR2 does a fine job. There's not much headroom for you until you exit ambient cooling. And then for the rest, buy the non-X versions of the chips. If you can overclock, if you can spend 5 minutes of your time, that's where overclocking matters. Overclocking 2700X, 2600X, not exciting. Overclocking the 2700 to become a 2700X, that's where you get your money's worth with overclocking. So to be clear, I'm not contradicting myself by saying don't overclock, but overclock. I'm saying don't bother overclocking the X series, overclock the non-X series, save $30 or whatever it is, and be happy that you did. If you absolutely can't overclock for some reason, I guess buy the X series. Now, as far as comparison to Intel, we gave you plenty of charts. Look over them, figure out what's best for you. This video is quite long. If you want more of a hard conclusion of AMD versus Intel, I can try and guide you through it, but I'm going to do it in the article linked in the description below on the conclusion page where I have some more space to think about it. So that's it for now. Subscribe for more. We have a lot more coming. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to buy one of our mod mats. They're on back order. You guys keep buying them and we sell out. But we have more coming now, so they'll be here within a couple of weeks and shipping again. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.